So Mara Nelson, she's been a mentor throughout the training program and certainly will be available to you all if you have questions about quality management systems and such, but she can't be here today due to a health issue with her mother. And then Josh Kim will also be missing, but we'll have Jill Harradine and Jim joining Lynn on this panel discussion. So without further ado, I think I'll hand it off to Lynn and she can have her panelists introduce themselves.
All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully James will get on in a few moments. As Terry mentioned, two of our panelists had to leave, unfortunately. So Jill and I and James, when he gets on, we'll do our best. Just to introduce myself, I am a faculty member at the University of Washington in the School of Pharmacy, where I teach biomedical regulatory affairs. My career has been both in industry and in academia. I've been worked in 3 local biotechnology companies here in Seattle and been on teams that have brought 4 products to market. Most all of these products are pharmaceuticals, and so that is my primary area of expertise, although having joined the university about 10 years ago in a regulatory capacity, I've become very familiar with medical devices, as most of the medical products coming out of the university, I would say about 80% of them are medical devices. And so I will be sharing through the questions that I asked the panelists information about how they think about the regulatory processes involved in medical product development. So with that, let me turn it over to Jill to give you some of her background.
Hi, I'm Jill Harradine. I am on the other side of the coin in on the drug space. I work at a small startup biotech company that's developing an allogeneic cellular therapy for patients undergoing transplant, hematologic transplants, allogeneic transplant. My career has spanned almost 25 years now across different therapeutic moieties, but all on the drug side, from small molecules to biologics and now to cell therapies. I've never worked on gene therapy, but a lot of the regulations are similar. So I kind of have a very different experience from, the device end of things.
We were just finishing introductions. If you could introduce yourself, please.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Jim Kleinedler. I'm getting over a bit of a cold, so apologize for my voice. But I started my career at the FDA as a pre-market reviewer, and then relocated from Washington, D.C. to Minneapolis area, started working for Boston Scientific. And I was in their regulatory department and interventional cardiology, and served as an internal consultant across their business related to regulatory and clinical, and then transitioned to Medtronic recently in January of this year. And I'm a director of regulatory strategy in our corporate team that works across all of our portfolio businesses, and I help teams out with, again, regulatory and clinical sort of questions that come up. And really happy to be here today. I participated in this forum several times now, and so I hope we have a great discussion. Thanks again for the invite.
Thank you. So since you're here, I'll go back to the original order of the questions that I posed. When we first did this, I looked at it from the point of view of the experiences that new inventors, new entrepreneurs have when they come for a consultation for regulatory affairs. The FDA looms very large as a boogeyman in the background, and it seems to intimidate people. First, they don't want to talk to them, and second, they don't really know how to find information. So it's a big void. And that's part of why we're here, is to help help you understand that this isn't that hard. It obviously takes time to learn the regulatory environment for your product type. But in my experience, the FDA has been extremely helpful in new product development. They take a lot of pride in bringing new products forward. And so I hope at the end of this, you'll understand that they're not an agency that you need to be afraid of, but certainly to respect their role and the functions that they have. So the first question that I had was, what regulatory information is critical to an early startup company? And when should you start investing in regulatory consultations or even a regulatory person on your staff? And that question is for James.
Yeah, thanks, Lynn. So it's a really great question, and I think it speaks to sort of the comprehensive nature of medical device design and entrepreneurship and business aspect of it. There is a lot of focus on, in my experience, on what the value proposition is and what the voice of customer is. And so getting out and making sure you're talking with, the community of physicians that would be using your device, really understanding what the needs of the patients are, and defining that unmet need. That seems to be key in the value proposition and kind of critical to the success of the business case. Once you've established that, I think you'll have a better sense of what the market size is and who the particular competitors are in that space that are addressing needs similar to what you're going after, or maybe tangential to what you're going after. And that should help you define what the patient population is, and have some more confidence and again, like what exactly the market is you're going after. That baseline informs then when you think about the regulatory strategy and like what evidence you might need to collect to support your product. That having that baseline of what the unmet need is, what the patient population is, helps you define not only your indications and kind of what claims you want to be making for your device, because those tend to specify the population as well, but also what population you would study in your clinical trial if you needed to collect clinical evidence. So those are some, and having that baseline of really what the need is, what the patient population is, what the market size is key. And it kind of, a lot of things cascade from that.
Maren, who couldn't be here today, took the effort to answer the question as well. And I think her points are important as well. We're talking about FDA like they're the only game in town in terms of product development, but she wanted you to be aware that there are a lot of other regulations that a regulatory affairs person would need to know about as well, and that are important to the business case. So some of the examples she gave are OSHA, workplace safety. So for a device that would include electrical safety, hazardous materials, pinching hazards. Trade and tariffs are important for importing or exporting materials, and shipping, she gave as an example, lithium batteries or hazardous materials. So we're not spending a lot of time today on these other regulations, but she did want you to be aware that there's a larger universe out there in terms of things to know about your business case. Jill, before we move on, do you have any other slant you'd like to give in terms of the pharmaceutical side of how you look at the business case for a new indication, for example?
James kind of highlighted the key points that I think across boundaries between drug and devices is unmet need and precedent. So those are key themes. So, having a general idea of your indication or your target indication in the context of unmet need is an important regulatory lens to look at things for. And then I think he also highlighted the importance of relying on precedent to help inform kind of arguments around unmet need in a similar space as a starting off point. That's very foundational for any conversation you're going to have.
Exactly. And in my experience, understanding precedent for pharmaceuticals may mean the class of the drug, the mechanism of action, or it could mean the patient population. A lot to be learned from those that went before in terms of how they.
Yeah, I mean, it could mean a lot of different things for
Yes.
a lot of different questions. I rely on precedent for almost everything, but sometimes access to precedent information is hard to get at outside of what's in the label. But precedent is really important in driving regulatory decision making on the manufacturing end, on the quality end, on the clinical end, on the safety end. So it, it's extremely important depending on the scope of the question.
James,
Yeah,
go ahead.
maybe I would just highlight that point, because I think that's really important, is that in regulation precedent, it really does play like an outsized role in how regulators view new devices that come to them. They're always thinking through, how am I going to reconcile my decision on this particular drug or device with what has come before it,
Right.
and what might come after it. And so if you can get a handle on what has come before your particular product in this space or a similar space, it'll really help you, I think, just narrow down and focus on what sort of things might we say in an indication, and also, what have other companies had to do to get their product on the market. And FDA, through they have publicly available product summaries for devices and drugs as well, that outline what other companies have had to do in terms of performance, like device qualification testing. And so that also is, in talking about business case and laying out what the investment might look like, that sort of intel is really valuable.
Yeah. I had a question here, and Marin actually wrote a response, so I think I'll use hers for this one. But since so many of you are working on medical devices, I thought it might be worth spending a little bit of time on helping you understand intended use from indication from use. If you look at the summary reports for medical devices, sometimes both are listed, sometimes only one is listed. And so it causes confusion sometimes when you're approaching the FDA and you're not quite sure what is how to talk about intended use versus indication for use. So Marin had a nice example here. Intended use is what the device is meant to accomplish: treatment of cancer, extremity support, infusion system. The indications for use are when you would use it. And this is in typically the subset of patients or the subset of the diseases that would be impacted by this product. Another way to look at it for those of you doing in vitro diagnostics is the test, the intended use of the diagnostic is to measure something, for example. The indication for use could be monitoring disease activity. James, do you have anything you'd like to add to that in terms of intended versus indication for use?
I would say those two, so intended use and indications, are probably like, if I had to, put a number around it, like 30% of the conversation that you're going to have with FDA in the early days of understanding what's required and how your device might be regulated is going to be around the claims you're making. And the intended use is what I think of as more of like the higher level claim. So it's the claim on what your device does, the general purpose of it. What does it do? How does it work? The indication for use is more specific. It's sort of defining the condition under which the device will be used. So that's more about the patient. And so it speaks to the illness, the injury, the disease, things like that. So those, like, you want to be crystal clear on those things. And again, like, there's precedent for the distinction between those in publicly available product summaries that are available online in the US. And those sorts of documents are becoming more and more available in Europe as well, with the new regulation in Europe. So there should be a good source of intel there too on labeling and what other companies have done with intended use and indications for use.
Jill, I know that indications for use in cancer are quite detailed. Could you talk a little bit about how specific these become in the cancer realm?
How specific indications become?
Yeah. What I'm thinking of is oftentimes there's all these caveats in an indication for use. It's in patients with a certain stage of disease. It's in patients that have failed other therapies, those types of things.
The general, and I think this is true for class 3 devices as well. The general rule of thumb and overall takeaway message as it relates to therapeutics for the indication is the target indication you're going to get from in your label at the end of the day will be directly related to the representative patient population that you evaluated the drug in. So how you characterize that representative patient population is critical. And so so it's important, and I think this is important on the device end too, to think about things holistically. And what I mean by holistically is, at the point you're at now, when you're developing your device or your diagnostic, think about where you want that, how you want that intended use to look, and make sure that you're designing your program. And if in the case of class 3 devices, your studies that are, it sounds obvious, but that are representative of the intended use of the population that you want to get the device approved on, or the therapeutic approved for. So, it sounds obvious. It's harder to implement because there's always, challenges operationally to doing the kind of study you want to do, cost, what have you. But available therapies in the area of therapeutics, available therapies is a complexity that I don't think is as relevant for devices. But it sounds obvious, but it's important to remember that's the holy grail. That the study that you design will be reflective in the intended use of the population. So,
right. You can't do a study in one population and by inference have it applied to some other population. Yeah.
But
makes
there's
sense.
There's a lot of things like sponsors will say, oh, well, I couldn't evaluate that population because it's hard to actually enroll those patients. Okay, well, your indication is going to be reflective of what you enroll. So these kinds of things, these kinds of conversations, believe it or not, happen a lot, and they happen late in the game. And it's important to remember that early in the game, you need to keep your focus on what your intended use is, or be willing to compromise on your intended use.
So one of the things that we do in a company environment is to write a regulatory strategy. In fact, we do that at the university as well. And that's it evolves over time, but it's typically something that looks at the landscape of the product, looks at this precedent that we've been talking about, lays out information about where we think you might have to go based on this precedent. Might bring in these other regulations like Maren mentioned the clinical trials that have gone before. So there's a lot of early reconnaissance, so to speak, that goes into developing a regulatory strategy. So I just wanted to ask Jill and James, in terms of their experience, when do you write this document? What are the things that you're trying to get out of it, and how often are you changing it? Jill.
So I write I don't like have like I used to in previous roles have like a slide deck that I put together. Now I put together like kind of a Word document that it's a dynamic document that goes through iterative changes over the development life cycle. But it has a couple key areas that outline the strategy and help frame our North Star, so to speak. One of them is what we just talked about, is the intended use. So the therapeutic indication, that is where you start and that's where you end the whole experience of your development program. So I talk about kind of this, how do we structurally achieve that therapeutic indication, and then therapeutics that is really structurally achieved through our clinical development program. So how do we, how do we outline that? How, we usually have a phase 1 study or a phase 1b study. So you outline your whole clinical development program, how you achieve proof of concept, how you confirm clinical benefit, or how you achieve clinical proof of concept, and then further confirm that proof of concept in a larger scale study, and whether that's a pivotal study or a lead into a pivotal study. So you kind of outline your development plan, and an important part of that outlining your development plan is highlighting where does that development plan fit, strategically speaking, in the context of the therapeutic landscape. And that is kind of forms the background of your document, so to speak. So where does this novel agent, or assuming it's novel or whatever, if it's not novel, where does this therapeutic fit, and how these current patients get treated now? Will it address an unmet need? Is it replacing a current therapy? Is it after a current therapy? Because there is nothing available for that patient after standard of care. So kind of understanding where it fits structurally in the landscape, the therapeutic landscape. And then I outline the development plan with my clinical colleagues and put together kind of a probability of success assessment, so to speak, on what regions the drug could potentially get approved based on the skeleton of our development plan. And part of the regulatory strategy, because regulators are looking at benefit risk as a whole when they make decisions, any kind of decisions, whether it be for a device or for a drug, is I kind of summarize, after I outline the development plan, I summarize the benefit risk and what that means to the regulators and to the prescribers, and why they would, if the data reads out the way we think it should, and the safety profile is favorable like we think it would be, how will that look in terms of an approvability in these different regions, because it might be different. So regional applicability of the benefit risk is really important based on the available therapies. So that's kind of those are key areas of my regulatory strategy document that touch on things we've already talked about: precedent, landscape, therapeutic indication, development program, things like that.
Thank you. James, do you have anything to add from the device side?
No, the only thing I might just highlight, I thought that was a great summary, is around the region-specific requirements. So that's a big area of focus for us in these regulatory strategy documents, and it kind of goes back to defining your, really understanding what your patient population is, what the need is, what the indication and the labeling is going to be. It helps you identify, from a market sizing perspective, which geographies are you going to go to for commercialization? Is the U.S., going to be sufficient to get the returns and, make the investment attractive, or do you have to go to other geographies as well? For whatever therapy you're going after, certain geographies maybe are going to be enriched for that disease state or condition, and so that might help you define where you're going with it. But I would say the better we have performed diligence into what the requirements are in different geographies, and bake those in early to the strategy, the more smooth everything goes, and you're not surprised on the back end. So that is an area of focus, and I think that the more smart you can be in that area, it just really does provide you with more confidence in the ability to be successful with that strategy.
Yeah, another thing in terms of startups and university settings that I've seen is that there's often a decision being made very early in the game of whether to follow up on patent protection in geographies outside of the United States. And fortunately, what I'm seeing is that because of costs, um, that some of these startups are choosing to focus solely in the United States and are potentially losing that market outside. And so that's another part of that strategy that needs to be discussed very early on if you have expectation that you'll be expanding out into other areas of the world. The other thing to be aware of is that at least when I did it several years ago, when I was at Zymogenetics, is that because of the regulations for phase 1 clinical trials, it turned out to be advantageous to us to do the phase 1 clinical studies in England as opposed to the United States, because we only had to go through IRB approval there as opposed to a whole regulatory review by EMA or FDA. So just another thing to be thinking about and understanding about the regulations for early phase studies. It may be beneficial to you to be going outside of the US as a start.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let me move on from regulatory strategies. You've heard from Jill that a regulatory strategy is not just a regulatory person sitting in a corner writing this thing by themselves, that in a company, everybody is participating, everybody has an opinion. It's very important to get those opinions because it does impact that indication for use that we keep talking about and being very clear about what it is. In my experience with pharmaceuticals, that often includes not only the clinical people, it includes the non-clinical people, it includes the manufacturing people, because everyone's involved and everyone needs to understand when the early product will be available for testing, et cetera. It all informs the plan. I'm going to move a little bit into, so this is specific for devices, since there's many of you, all of you, I guess, that are interested in devices. There's certain categories of devices that FDA has put under what they call enforcement discretion. And I'd like James to talk a little bit about what that means in terms of what does a device manufacturer still have to do or not have to do if the product they're developing falls under that umbrella of enforcement discretion.
Yeah, sure. So I can touch on that. So, so FDA routinely reviews their framework, how they classify devices, class 1, 2, 3, and some of the class 2 products are going to fall under what FDA calls enforcement discretion, which means that they no longer require a pre-market notification to market the device. So for class 2 devices, typically you would submit a 510K to allow commercialization of that device in the US. Now, if FDA has determined that over time there's been an accumulation of safety data such that for a device with a long history of clinical use, that they feel the benefit risk profile is such that they no longer need to be reviewing 510Ks and just be prioritizing the limited bandwidth that they do have to other areas, maybe more evolving areas or areas with higher uncertainty in that benefit risk profile. They'll say that for these types of product codes, which identifies a sort of a category of devices, we no longer need to review those 510Ks. So you can go ahead and commercialize those devices without 510K submission. And that doesn't obviate the need to still, manufacture under 21 CFR 820. You're still subject to the quality system requirements for manufacture of those devices and all of the documentation that goes along with that. But it just sort of takes away that requirement for you to need to get a clearance of a 510K before you can go to market.
Jill, could you briefly just review for the people attending what breakthrough means and other important acceleration pathways that you think about when you're writing regulatory strategies?
Yeah, I think about them not just at the onset, but throughout, right? Because but typical ones you'll hear about in the drug world are what we call expedited approval pathways, or expedited regulatory programs that are not necessarily just about approval. Some of them are, ways to expedite the development to get to approval. Those include things like breakthrough designation, which is relatively new, about a little over 10 years old designation that was passed by Congress, really to help push engender cancer therapeutics. The impetus was cancer drugs. It was really sponsored by the Friends of Cancer Research to get approved faster, especially areas of strong unmet need for rare diseases. That particular designation requires clinical data. But you might have heard of things like fast track designation, which is a similar, a close distant cousin to breakthrough. And that loosely looks very similar in terms of benefits, where you can help a sponsor expedite their development program. But in that particular case, you could, you don't necessarily need clinical data. You could actually have very impressive non-clinical data, animal data that would help spur FDA's decision to give you fast track. And then at the approval stage, and then another close distant relative to breakthrough is what is called RMAT status, or regenerative medicine advanced therapy for bridge cell and gene therapies. And that looks very similar in terms of benefits. You have more, the crux of it is you get more interaction with the agency, and you can call them, and you have the attention of the division director. And then there are things on the approval end, like accelerated approval, and but that's a little bit different than expedited programs.
Yeah, and I would say from my experience, the drugs that I was involved with were for orphan diseases. And so having orphan drug status, if that's appropriate for your indication for use, also gives you benefits in terms of more access to FDA, faster review, and tax advantages once it's on the market. James, could you briefly talk about the new, I guess, relatively new breakthrough status for devices?
Yeah, sure. So there's a program for devices you may be familiar with called Breakthrough Device Designation, and it's been around for about 5 years now. And there's over 700 devices that FDA has designated as breakthrough, which essentially means that FDA has determined that there is that your device provides for a more effective therapy or diagnosis of a life-threatening or irreversibly debilitating disease or condition. So they have a guidance out there you can find, which lays out the definition for how you would meet that threshold of more effective, or what the FDA defines as a life-threatening or irreversibly debilitating disease. And if you get accepted into this program, which currently the acceptance rates on the device side are about 35% get accepted, you realize sort of expedited feedback. It's kind of similar to what Jill just covered, expedited FDA feedback. You get prioritized in the queue when there's a backup, in the amount of bandwidth that reviewers might have. You get more focused on clinical strategy, and the FDA is more willing to consider maybe more progressive or creative clinical design, and so it's intended to provide a benefit and communication with the agency and more flexible clinical trial design. There's also some reimbursement benefits associated with breakthrough on the device side, which are real attractive to industry. And so I guess I would end by just saying that FDA has published a list of the breakthrough device designations that they've granted and then have since been commercialized. And so you can see that. You can just Google and find that database. And there's also I'm trying to think what the group is that there's it's called, well, I can maybe put it in the chat here in a second, but there's another site that has collated all the publicly announced breakthrough designations. So there's hundreds and hundreds of these. This isn't something that FDA publishes. Like, it's not publicly available when a company does get breakthrough. So it's sometimes hard to find out, again, what the precedent is. Like, how likely am I to get breakthrough based on who else has gotten breakthrough? But this site that I'll send you has gone through press releases and things like that to identify companies and devices that have been granted breakthrough. So it's a great kind of intel source if you're looking to see, how likely am I to get breakthrough. Gives you some history there, which can be useful.
Yeah, and I would say that, I mean, the FDA is required to publish how successful they are with these programs that are intended to expedite approval or clearance of medical products. And so it can be every year there's a report that comes out that says this is how many we gave, this is who got it, this is what they are. So that information, you can look for that on their website and give you more information about kind of that precedent again and what they went through. I'm gonna
they actually produce that as part of their PDUFA report.
Right.
They give those metrics out for drugs. I'm pretty sure they do it for devices as well. So
they do, yeah. So important to look at that because you can see kind of where you are in the field here.
But you want to look for it in the context. The actual metrics only come out in the PDUFA report.
Yeah. PDUFA.
MedTech Insight. That's the name of the site.
Oh, okay.
That you can go to and find the breakthrough history.
So I'm assuming that a lot of the people attending this session are new to the development space. If I'm wrong, let me know. But I guess I wanted to finish up and ask both of the other panelists, when do you first go to the FDA? What do you need to have in your hands before you feel comfortable going and asking your questions? And I'll start with Jill.
It's all based on the questions, so I go when I have specific questions that I can't answer. I mean, is the long short of the answer. But there are strategically key interactions, if that's what you're getting at.
Yes.
There are key interactions such as the pre-IND meeting to get alignment with the agency on your IND package, which is essentially your first application. And most of that conversation is focused on your non-clinical package because that's really all you have at that point, and the design of your phase 1 study. So that's a key interaction. The most critical interaction with the agency on the therapeutics ends is at your end of phase 2 meeting. And the primary goal to walk away from that meeting is alignment with the agency, or at least agreement to aspects of your phase your confirmatory study design, so your registrational study design. So that could be a phase 2 study, or it could be a randomized study, depending on the patient population. Again, that the unmet need and available therapies comes into that. So that's a critical, and you can imagine that's probably the most critical. And then the other key one is the pre-BLA meeting or the pre-NDA meeting. And these are all where you kind of align on the contents of your plan submission. That's usually your phase 3 or your pivotal data is read out, and you're getting you're dotting your I's and crossing your T's and getting everything in order for your BLA filing, and you don't want any surprises during the review and the validation of the application. So those are your like most critical, but then those are what we call our type B meetings. And then, but there are other meetings that happen, and we call a type C, that can come up based on issues and agenda-driven basis. And those have different sets of timelines, but depending on back to the expedited, if you have breakthrough or fast track or RMAT status, you might be able to get FDA's ear more frequently and engage them on an issue level basis. But in the absence of that, those are the standard meetings that you would have.
I would add that in my experience, I worked for startups as well, and we didn't have a lot of experience like a big pharmaceutical company would. And the FDA recognized on their own that we needed some help on the manufacturing side in terms of the assays that we were assuming we would need for release of product, and they didn't think what we had proposed was sufficient. And so on their own, they called us up and said, we'd like to have a meeting with you just to talk about your CMC plans, which was extremely helpful. It avoided a number of problems, and I was surprised when that happened because we didn't even ask for it. James, your turn. So in terms of devices, let me just give you a preface. So what I see a lot at the university, you probably have a very different environment at Medtronic. They're a very sophisticated and advanced company. In the university setting, we have a lot of engineers that are tinkering a bit with a new device. They've got prototypes, they've got plans, they have questions about the FDA path. And I guess I'd like your advice to them in terms of when is the right time for them to first have a conversation with the FDA? What state should their device be in before they go?
Yeah, so it's a common, I would say, misconception that you need to have everything kind of buttoned up and ready to go before talking with the FDA. They have different types of meetings, and one type of pre-submission is a pre-submission meeting is a informational meeting, and so that's when FDA is more or less in listening mode, and you just go and you introduce them to the technology and what indications you're going after, and it's an orientation kind of, and you also get to build a sort of rapport with the review team, or at least make introductions and kind of get your face in front of them, and name recognition and all of that, so that it can be valuable to establish kind of a baseline of communication with them through that meeting. That leads then into subsequent, more substantive conversations about strategy. FDA has suggested previously that they'd recommend not coming more than maybe a year out from when you're intending to submit your marketing application, I think, or a clinical trial. And I think that can be, I think the point of that sort of recommendation is to acknowledge that their feedback or their input to you during these meetings can change depending on what else is going on in the ecosystem, right? If there's high profile recalls on devices that are similar to yours that come out closer to when you're starting your trial or your marketing application, that might lead to other types of concerns or questions that FDA might not have communicated in a pre-submission meeting, a year prior to that. And so they're just trying to kind of make sure that their feedback is relevant, timely, and still relevant to you when you're actually engaging in more of your trial applications or marketing applications. So I think, for those real strategic, substantive interactions where you're really down selecting on a clinical trial strategy, or aligning on a predicate strategy, or talking to them about your PMA modules, like it's probably good to leave about 12 months in between when you're having those conversations and submitting your first module or your first submission. But going to them earlier than that for kind of introductions and maybe more high level discussion is definitely like something I'd recommend.
Okay, the last set of questions, and I'm not going to ask the panelists this. I'm just going to provide you with Marin's input on this. But one of the things I see a lot in an academic setting is that inventors don't have a very good structure for documentation of what they're doing, and they end up doing rework when they get further down the path because they haven't written things down in a useful way. So Marin just wanted to talk about, or make sure you're aware that starting the development in the device world of something called a design history should start now. Don't wait, start it now. It's an iterative process, just like every other document we've been talking about. But this is where you start writing down what your users want. This is where you start writing down how you're going to make a device that does what your users want, and how you're going to test your device to show that it does what you think it's supposed to do. There's just a lot of information, even in pharmaceuticals, when you're working in a research lab, writing your reagents down, making sure that the assays that you're running are well documented, because someday in the future, you're going to transfer those to another facility, and they can't still be on a paper towel. They have to be in a very well documented SOP type format that you can transfer to somebody else. So that was her advice. Don't worry about the fact that it's not the final product. Everything builds on it. So getting a system in place to start documenting this information sooner than later is our advice to you. So we have like 3 minutes left. I would love to see if there's any questions. Yes. Terry's reminding me, so I am part of a team at the university that provides consulting to inventors, along with Teddy Johnson, Terry Butler, and Cindy Jacobs. And so if you're in that setting and makes sense, please let us know, and we'd be happy to talk to you more about your product, or get you in the hands of someone that knows more about your product type than we do. Any questions?
And I did want to point out, I mean, these regulatory experts throw a lot of terms around and a lot of places to look. It is complicated, and honestly, the FDA is open to people scheduling meetings with them, but you really don't want to go to the FDA unless you've done a lot of planning with someone with regulatory experience. So it's not like having a research conference meeting. There are specific things and approach that you prepare for the FDA to consider, and specific ways that you approach it. So don't be afraid to reach out to us at the Technology Development Center or others with regulatory expertise to get yourself lined up with someone who can help you with that.
Yeah, and I'd say a big part of those meetings, as Jill said, is to answer questions you don't have the answers to. And so typically when you're asking a question, you're not saying, hey, FDA, tell me what to do. You're saying something like, this is what I plan to do because of X, Y, or Z. Does this make sense to you? Do you concur with this idea? And they'll tell you if they don't. But it's important to know, to be thinking about what you want to ask, why you want to ask it, and why you can't answer it yourself. Basically, there may be some competing information you're trying to figure out. Any other last words of wisdom from Jill or James?
I don't think so. I just want to thank you again for the opportunity, the invite. I think this is a great program. And if there's any other questions that come up afterwards, if you have a chance to sleep on it and you think of anything else, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to follow up.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, likewise, if you have any questions, but it sounds like this audience is not really developing.
They're not into cancer therapeutics yet. It'll come.
They probably know people who are, so now we
Yes,
know who
yeah.
to send them
Yeah.
to. Yeah, thank you so much, you guys. This is always an amazing panel. I appreciate you being here again for this session and being here for this round of innovators.